When you think of chickens, you don't often also think of pickup trucks. You might think of eggs, Nashville, or a 1980s insult.
You chicken?
But what if I told you that the tiny, flightless bird is responsible for shaping our entire modern pickup truck market? As with most of my video essays, we have to go back to World War II. After the war, our American troops returned home, ready to rejoin the workforce. Because of this, domestic farming kicked it into high gear, producing more poultry meat than ever before. Europe was struggling to recover as quickly, so they began purchasing poultry from the United States. We had plenty to go around. This went on for almost 2 decades, until the 1960s, when Europe was a little bit more recovered. In 1961, France and Germany began heavily taxing the importation of American poultry to help stimulate local business and discourage the purchase of American bird. The US immediately lost 25% of its business across the Atlantic, which really pissed us off. Many new agreements were brought to the table, but nothing seemed to solidify. In retaliation, the United States decided to tax certain imports from Europe. Those taxed imports were brandy, potato starch, dextrin, and light trucks. This particularly hurt Volkswagen the most, now placing a 25% tax on their light trucks and the Volkswagen bus. The tax was named the chicken tax due to its retaliation of the original tax. The American automakers were already feeling the pressure from European imports even before this tax was put in place, so they were the ones that lobbied for the tax on light trucks. So what classified a light truck? Well, it wasn't for heavy machinery, mainly because the US was still a top producer of those, so there wasn't really much of a threat. At the time, SUVs and crossovers didn't really exist, but when they came around, the tax was designated by rows of seats. If it had one row and was based off a light pickup truck, then it was taxed 25%. If it had 2 rows of seats, it wasn't taxed. It was considered a passenger vehicle. As you would imagine, this created a lot of loopholes, but we'll talk about that in a second. This tax was also a flat tax across the board, so while Europe was the original reason, any foreign-built truck was subject to the 25%. This especially hurt Japanese truck sales in the 1970s and 80s when their pickup truck market was booming. Toyota started offering the Toyota pickup, Mitsubishi had the Mighty Max, Mazda had the B Series, Isuzu had the Pup, and Nissan had the hardbody. So what were those loopholes? Because of how the tax was worded, there were several ways to get around it. For most of the Japanese trucks, they were sent here as rolling chassis. Since they were not complete, they were not subject to the tax. They were glorified car parts, allegedly. Once they arrived here on shore, their beds were fitted and the finer details were fastened, and they were sold in the States. This ended around 1980, conveniently when Ford and GM were ready to produce the S10 and the Ranger stateside. They put a kibosh on the rolling chassis loophole. As a response, the Japanese manufacturers began constructing factories in the States to avoid the tax altogether. That's why the Nissan hardbody was actually built here in Tennessee. Subaru had their own loophole. Because the tax was dropped for vehicles with 2 rows of seating, Subaru fitted awful rear-facing seats to the Subaru Brat, making it exempt from the 25%. That explains why many pickup trucks in the 80s had awful, unusable back seats. It was all to get around the tax. The most recent loophole was from Ford as recently as 2013. Ford's push for the tax back in the 1960s came back around to bite them as they ramped up production of the Ford Transit Connect in Turkey. They were now subject to the tax that they helped start. To get around it, all Ford Transit Connects would be imported with cheap, flimsy seats, making them technically passenger vehicles. Once stateside, the cheap seats were removed and recycled, making them into the cargo vans that the buyers had ordered, while also saving Ford money. Ford got in trouble for this a few years later, had to pay some fines, and we all moved on with our lives. So where does this leave the chicken tax today? Well, it's actually still in place, but only for light trucks. The tax on brandy, dextrin, and potato starch has since been dropped as new trade agreements across the Atlantic have been formed. This has changed our entire market for trucks, decimating almost all European trucks from our states. We miss out on cool trucks like these, all because of poultry sales in the 1950s and 60s. This also explains the lack of K-trucks. Although they were cheap, slap 25% on top of that, and it stood no chance against a Ford Ranger or Chevy S10. I hope you guys enjoyed this quick little video essay of the chicken tax. I think it's very, very interesting how it shaped trucks in that era, and still to this day, why we see so few foreign-built trucks and why vehicles like the Honda Ridgeline, Toyota Tundra, and Tacoma are built here in the United States. If you guys have an idea for a future video essay, please leave it in the comment section down below. But until next time,